this week. Our next guest is running to take on Donald Trump in 2020 and has been an outspoken opponent of Trump's immigration policies. He was also one of the first candidates to label Trump a white nationalist in the wake of the deadly mass shooting in his hometown of El Paso, Texas. And joining me now is former Congressman and 2020 presidential candidate Beto O'Rourke. And Congressman, thank you so much for your time this morning. And I want to just go right to your making of a distinction that I've made as well, which is that there's racism and there's white nationalism. And white nationalism in this instance is much more dangerous to human beings. What is, in your mind, the distinction between someone who is a racist and a white nationalist?
Well, in the president's case, because I think that's the most important example of this, you have someone who's talking about Mexican immigrants as rapists and criminals, who uses the words predator, animal, infestation to describe other human beings in an effort to dehumanize them and to allow people to treat them as less than human, which is exactly what you've seen happen along the U.S.-Mexico border. As you said, children separated from their parents, children put in cages like you would put an animal in a cage, and the fact that we've lost the lives of 7 children, at least that's what we know of, in our custody during this administration just over the last year. When you add to that an elevation of white nationalists and Klansmen and neo-Nazis by calling them very fine people, or asking or allowing or encouraging the crowd to chant, "Send her back," and they're just repeating the words that the president used to talk about people who do not look like or pray like the majority of this country. It is very clear that this president is a white supremacist when he says he wants immigrants from Nordic countries, but doesn't want them from Haiti because, as Donald Trump says, they have AIDS, which is not true, or he doesn't want those from Central America, or he calls the countries of Africa shithole nations. It is beyond the shadow of a doubt right now. And then when you have someone come to this community, drive 600 miles to kill, as he said, quote-unquote Mexicans, and to repel what he said in his manifesto was a quote-unquote Hispanic invasion, mirroring the words that Donald Trump has used, not only is this dangerous, not only does it offend our sensibilities, it is killing people in this country right now.
Yeah, and including in your community, you're in a unique position because you are a native of El Paso. This is your community where this is happening. And, as somebody who is in the super minority, essentially, as a white person in that community, you've lived the fear that a lot of white Americans frankly have of this no longer being a majority white nation. What do you say back to people who in their own minds might be ascribing to what you would describe as white nationalism, saying this should be a white country, which is what white nationalism is, and they're afraid that it won't be? Is there anything that a president could say back to them that would somehow shake them loose from that sense of white nationalism?
Where I stand right now in El Paso, Texas, with Ciudad Juarez behind me, may hold the key to the answer. We're the largest binational community in this hemisphere, 3 million speaking 2 languages from 2 cultures, 2 nations, joined as one people. And on this side of the border, El Paso, Texas is one of, if not the safest cities in the United States of America. And so I tell my fellow Americans that's not despite the fact that we're a city of immigrants, that we're 85% Mexican American, that asylum seekers first set foot in the United States right in this community. But all of those things, the very presence of those immigrants, makes us stronger and safer and, yes, more secure than we would otherwise be. So nothing to fear, nothing to be defensive about, nothing to wall up or put inside of a cage, everything to celebrate the best example of the United States of America. And if we do not tell our story here from El Paso, Texas, then others, like Donald Trump, will try to tell that story for us. And in fact, Donald Trump has told the country that we're one of the most dangerous cities in the country, though the facts show the complete opposite. So that's just a technique of propaganda, of fear, something that fascists use, something that we must rise up against. And I think the story of El Paso and Ciudad Juarez is the perfect counter example. It's true, it's factual, it's beautiful, and it's powerful.
Do you worry, you just used the term fascism, do you worry that that is what the Trump administration is leading the United States toward?
Absolutely. He's undermining every single institution that made this country great in the first place. Our genius in defining ourselves at the point of origin as a country of immigrants, saying that all of us are created equal, though we have never lived up to that. And we were well aware of that in 2019. We've always at least attempted to make this a more perfect union. And the leader of that effort has always been the President of the United States, with some exceptions, but never so exceptional as this president, who not only tries to define us as a white nation, but undermines the judiciary, the sanctity of the ballot box, inviting a foreign power to involve themselves in our last elections and in our future elections, as he just did a couple of months ago, obstructing the pursuit of justice and every single norm that we hold dear to allow us to come together as a people of the planet who found a home in this country is being destroyed right now. Political violence used against those who do not look like the majority or threatened against his political opponents. Yes, Donald Trump is destroying this country, and it's incumbent upon all of us, Democrats, Republicans, independents alike, no matter where you live in the United States, not only to stand up against him, but to stand up for a country that serves every single one of us, regardless of the differences.
You know, when Donald Trump came to your community, I don't know if you saw this picture, which a lot of people have been circulating in horror, of himself and Melania Trump holding this baby who was orphaned in the massacre by that domestic terrorist who came to your community and killed so many people. And people have sort of described it as almost sort of a trophy, the way that they were holding, that they were posing with the thumbs up, etc. Why do you think he came to your community? What do you think I mean, I don't want you to read his mind, but what do you think the purpose of that was?
You know, I'll just tell you from our perspective here in El Paso, this community knows that it's been his rhetoric, his actions, his invitation to hate, and also to perpetuate violence that helped to produce the massacre, the act of terror that we saw last Saturday. And so this community did not want him to come. And nothing's more telling to this point than the fact that all of the patients, the survivors of this attack at University Medical Center and Del Sol, did not want to see the president. People who had been discharged, people in other parts of the community had to be brought in to the hospitals to greet the president. And then his comments there at the hospital and afterwards were not about the community, not about healing, not about bringing us together, not about standing up to racism and white supremacy and white terrorism. It was about himself and how much he thought people loved him, how much he wants us to think that people love him. Not only showing his insecurity, but really a sickness in being unable to be empathetic and to be with people at their moment of greatest pain and grieving and suffering. It's not what a president of the United States should be doing.
You know, we said in the intro that you've been one of the people who's been the most blunt about Donald Trump and white nationalism and racism and the things that he says and does. The pushback against that, and I don't want to do the typical media thing where it's like, answer this pushback and have to, sort of dignify it. But what a lot of Democrats are actually afraid of is that if they go there, if they say Donald Trump is a white nationalist, if they say that he's a racist, they're worried that it is just like another deplorables thing, that it'll just scare middle-of-the-road white voters away and make the Democrats lose in 2020. What do you make of that criticism?
Yeah, I think it's really important that we not write anybody off, not count anybody out, include everybody in the solutions to this country that include standing up to this kind of racism and white supremacy, standing up for sensible gun policy like universal background checks or ending the sales of weapons of war like the one used in El Paso, keep them on the battlefield, no longer allow them to be sold into our communities. But let me say this, Joy, if you were one of those who, when President Trump was at a rally in Florida and said, how are we going to stop these immigrants from invading our country? And someone yells, shoot them. And you laughed or you roared your approval or you sat in silence as the president smiled and he himself laughed in approval. You're part of the problem. If you're one of those in Greenville, North Carolina, who's chanting, send her back, you are part of the problem. And you have to take a long, hard look at yourself and your culpability and responsibility for what is happening here in this country. So I'm going to focus on the future and all of us coming together and ensuring that we stand up against this and stand for a much stronger, better America, one that includes every single one of us, regardless of our differences. And I invite everyone to be a part of that. But yes, you're right. There are people in this country who are contributing to the intolerance that we see, the violence that it produces, and there needs to be accountability for that.
And, so I've been in this sort of deep dive on the Mississippi raids and the companies that were raided. There is a strong connection between your community, between El Paso and Mississippi, in the sense that a lot of those workers that are working in those chicken plants, those chicken processing plants, came from El Paso and were part of your community before they were part of that Mississippi community. How would you, as president, enforce the laws that say that employers are not allowed to hire people who are undocumented? Because as we're seeing it right now, the billionaires that own these companies, nothing happens to them. It's only the people who are working in pretty dangerous jobs that end up getting seized and taken from their kids. How would you enforce that law differently?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, here are people in this country working the toughest jobs that we can imagine for a minimum wage if they're lucky. I think there are reported instances of wage theft in these processing plants. So maybe making less than a minimum wage, a kind of modern day bondage here in the United States of America. And really the victims are the ones who are being persecuted and prosecuted and torn from their families. And the perpetrators get off absolutely scot-free. I think the best possible solution going forward is to legalize those who are here in this country already, who in some instances have been here for decades, raising U.S. citizen children, contributing far more to the greatness and success and safety of this country than they can ever possibly take from. Imagine how much more they could do as legal permanent residents or as U.S. citizens. And then there needs to be a safe, orderly, lawful path for people to come to the United States to work, to join their families, to go to school. Comprehensive reform and rewriting of our immigration laws in the image of those communities in Mississippi or this community here in El Paso, Texas. It makes us stronger and safer than we would be otherwise. And I know that we can do it. I know that Republicans, Democrats, independents alike understand that this current immigration system is not working, is inhumane and unjust. And so let's get to work writing those laws together, implementing them, and then it resolves these kinds of issues from having to take place again in the future.
Well, in the meantime, until Congress deigns to pass those kind of immigration laws, do you think the CEOs of these companies should be prosecuted? And by the way, among the people who employs undocumented immigrants and does it pretty regularly is Donald Trump. So do you think the people who are the employers should be prosecuted?
Yes, they should. And it should not just be those immigrants who are bearing the brunt of prosecution, flying in 600 agents into Mississippi, not notifying child welfare employees so that they could help those terrified kids. This is a terrorizing event in that community for those families, those kids. I mean, that is the face of terror and torture for that child to have her parents taken from her, knowing not when or if she is going to see them again, not knowing when or if she is going to be taken care of. And that is part and parcel of what this administration is doing. And the rhetoric that you and I were just talking about that Donald Trump employs of invasions and infestations and animals and predators who are coming into our communities to take things from us, though we know they commit crimes at a far lower rate and contribute far more economically and financially than they will ever be able to draw down over the course of their lives. The only way to meet this challenge is to make sure that we have laws that match our values, our traditions, and a much stronger, brighter future for everyone, including those immigrants here in this country.
We've been talking a lot about, and before we go, I do want to let you talk about raising money. I know you're raising money for the communities that are hurting, where you live. But we've been talking a lot this morning about Mr. William Barr, the Attorney General of the United States, who is now going to be investigating this Jeffrey Epstein death. I don't know how much you've been able to even pay attention to that while you're paying attention to your own community. But if you're President of the United States, does William Barr stay in that job, and do you trust him as our Attorney General?
There's got to be accountability. There has to be justice, or else in this country you have impunity. And the rule of law dies. This great experiment in democracy goes away. And you have a lawless president who's being aided and abetted right now by a lawless attorney general who is refusing to acknowledge the co-equal role that Congress plays, who's refusing to investigate attacks on our democracy, and who I'm worried about in investigating the death of Epstein and the circumstances surrounding it. And then you have the President of the United States tweeting conspiracy theories, linking it to a former president of this country, his political enemy, using this position of power and public trust to pursue vengeance using lies and misinformation. Again, we need an attorney general. We need a government that works for all of us and will stand up for the rule of law, not the petty interests of the current occupant of the White House.
Before we let you go, Congressman, I know you're raising money for the communities that have been hurt in El Paso, people who've lost loved ones. Very quickly, tell people who want to help those families and help those kids, what can they do?
There's two great foundations here in El Paso helping victims and their families of last week's terror attack. The El Paso Community Foundation has a site at epcf.org/victims. And then the Paso del Norte Health Foundation also has a website up. We encourage people to donate to help the families here in El Paso and in Ciudad Juarez. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Beto O'Rourke, candidate for president, thank you very much. We appreciate your time this morning. And all the best to your community.
Thank you, Joy.
Thank you. All right. And coming up, we mark a very dark moment in American history. That's next.